Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, February 19th, and I think we got to talk about this meeting in Riyadh. So maybe just start us off. How big of a meeting was this? How significant is it? What are you feeling?
Yeah. Well, it's very significant. It's a very big meeting. You have two very high-powered delegations led by the Russian and U.S. Secretary of States. You know, of course, Lavrov's not exactly a Secretary of State, but he's the equivalent. He's um, the, the foreign minister. Um, yeah. So um, this is a huge event, mainly because of the very abnormal state of affairs that has obtained over the last few years, especially the last 3 years since the start of the SMO. Just absolutely no diplomatic relations at all, just almost zero contact. Occasional contact, I think, between the militaries and maybe the intelligence services, but very, very minimal. Um, and now they're talking, and that's wonderful. That's something I think it's an unequivocal good that we should celebrate. Um, and we haven't. They're not actually. They haven't actually entered into negotiations about the Ukraine conflict. The idea is to lay the groundwork for those negotiations and for a meeting between their presidents. But they have already achieved, I think, a notable success, and that is the they are going to restaff the embassies, and I imagine later the consulates too, that were just, basically reduced to skeleton crews by the previous administration. Now it has to say that goes all the way back to Obama. It was at the end of his term that he banished something like 30 embassy staff from the Russian embassy in Washington D.C. But it really accelerated under Biden. So now we have just there aren't even ambassadors in the respective embassies. And if you're going to be talking and communicating and preventing, misunderstandings and escalations, you need to have these people. You need to have these diplomats in place. And the good news is that they have committed to repopulating or restaffing, I should say, the embassies. I think that's a notable success. That's nothing to sneer at. That's really very important. Um, let's see. But as for, again, they haven't entered into the negotiations. And I still think that that's going to be very difficult. But just the fact that they're talking makes this conflict less dangerous. One thing that we worried about under the previous administration was this continual escalation. And we really, at the end, it became very dangerous where, of course, we really should say the Western forces. We pretend that it's Ukraine, but it was really NATO with the U.S. very much involved, and definitely the U.S. was involved, was firing missiles. They were participating in the firing of missiles into pre-2014 Russian territory. So they were engaged in direct attacks on Russian territory. And the Russians were saying, hey, you can't do this. So we got the Oreshnik response. But then later the responses, the U.S. continued with these provocations, but the Russians' responses were very muted. And I think the reason is that they saw Trump was coming in. That was and Trump gave signals and in fact said quite directly, this is stupid. We're not going to do that. And so far he's held to his word, because if you may notice that since he's been in office, there haven't been any of these ATACMS strikes that I'm aware of. I saw one report something like 2 weeks ago, but it was never confirmed, just on a Telegram channel. And I never saw anything again, so I don't think anything happened. I don't think there have been any ATACMS strikes. And that's an example of how, sadly the war goes on and probably will go on for a while, but it becomes much less dangerous if you're talking.
Yeah, the fact that we've had no communication with Russia for the past 3 years during this conflict, and now we have some communication, it makes me feel, my initial reaction is that we're almost like friends again, but that's not really true, right? I mean,
No,
it's
we got
still
a
there's
Right.
How do you gauge the relationship right now between Russia and the U.S. just with this
Right.
new administration?
Right.
You wouldn't say it's friendly, but there's diplomacy. How would you
Yeah.
say?
Well, I think, this is true of Trump in general. Trump, again, he has many faults. I don't want to call him a great peacemaker or anything. But he doesn't share these hatreds that I think Biden had, well, for the Russians and even for the Chinese, even though he considers China a threat and wants to pivot to Asia. Um, I don't think you don't see the continued demonization of Putin or the Russian government or the Russians in general. That really seems to have ended, and um, and it seems to be true of his team. It's now the thing is they may have the interests just may not coincide. Their policies and domestic political needs and all these other things. And I think for all these various reasons, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually negotiate a settlement to the war. But you just don't sense the hatred that was there, that really made things so dangerous under Biden. Because I think he really hated Putin. He hated and really hated the Russian government in general. And it seemed to extend even though they would deny it to the Russian people. And so that's I think that's important. I think it's quite significant. And that a lot of these these statements that Trump has made about the Russians. And you notice there was in Rubio's very famous, it should be famous anyway, interview with Megyn Kelly. He's talking about the emerging multipolar world. There was a complete lack of the usual opprobrium that's used to be directed at the Russians. There were none of these condemnations, none of these demonizing words. And so I think we've entered new territory, and it's really encouraging. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't changed, vis-a-vis Iran and the Middle East, and then a lot of these people do seem to be China hawks. So it's not like the world is all of a sudden singing Kumbaya.
Right. Well, I think just the relationship, if it's being repaired between Russia and the U.S., will start to extend to Iran and to China, because obviously this is
Right.
Russia's world. They're very close to China and Iran, and I think they will have influence on the United States relationship with those countries as well. And something that gives me a little bit of hope, maybe even more than a little bit, is that Trump is a businessman. Witkoff is there. He's a businessman. And, they're talking a lot. They're talking more than just Ukraine. They're talking about, larger, geopolitical spheres of influence and the sort of global security architecture, but also just a cooperation on economic fronts, potential Arctic exploration for oil and energy. And I think this type of stuff really excites Trump. This is what he's all about. And I think you can find a lot of common ground here, and the Russians can get excited about this as well. And engaging in these mutually beneficial business deals between these two countries, I think, could go a long ways. And who knows, maybe Russia could be, dare I say, a friend of the United States by the end of this term. Do you think that's possible, or is that just... I feel like, has Russia ever been a friend of the United States? I feel like they've always been the bad guy.
Well, of course, there was, except during World War II, they were our ally, right?
Temporary friends.
Yeah, right, temporary friends. And then, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, well, and then the Gorbachev years, the last years of the Soviet Union, and then the 1990s. Unfortunately, that friendship was kind of... was a disaster for Russia in the 1990s, and they have very, very bad memories of it. But relations at the top in general were friendly. They were getting frayed even under Yeltsin at the end, because Yeltsin, though he was weak and you couldn't quite call him a puppet of the U.S., he became frustrated and by the complete disregard for Russian interests. The movement of NATO to the east. But relations all in all were pretty good then. But since then, yeah, we generally you look over the last 110 years, and yeah, we've been enemies most of
Right.
that
So,
time.
I know we have a long ways to go, but I just feel like perhaps what we've seen happen in just the past since Trump came into office is the potential for to bury that hatred and to really have a working relationship with
Yeah.
Russia as a peer. Do you feel like we're moving in that direction and that there's
Well,
reason to really hope?
there is reason to hope. Again, let's set the war aside. Well, one thing I think actually Alexander McClure has made a very good point the other day. He said, like, during the Vietnam conflict, where that was, the Soviet Union supported the North Vietnamese, and we had intervened directly on the side of the South Vietnamese, and American soldiers were being killed, and it was a very bloody war, as most of us either remember or know. Um, Negotiations actually began between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, it didn't end the war. The war went on for another 8 years. I think the negotiations began in 1967, but they led to détente. They led to these arms reduction treaties, and they made the world a safer place. They improved relations. I mean, relations weren't, they didn't become friends afterwards, but the fear of imminent, uh, nuclear war was greatly diminished by those moves. So we could see something analogous here, meaning that, okay, though the negotiations failed to achieve a settlement in the war, I mean, it's not impossible. Maybe Trump and his team will really surprise us, but I think probably they can't do that. It doesn't mean they can't do a lot of other good things, and we're seeing that already, like with the restaffing of the embassies, and then this talk about economic cooperation. That's something, again, because he's not an ideological zealot. He looks at the bottom line, and that can be kind of ugly sometimes. Let's face it. but it's um, but it all but it's let's say it's transactional. It's real. And all in all, like, the businessman's view of the world is not about conquest, but it's about cooperation. And to the extent that he's looking at the world as a businessman, I think he has a positive vision. Um, and yeah, I mean, the fact is that these sanctions on Russia had not only failed to bring about the collapse of the Russian economy, quite the reverse, as we've talked about many times, but they've been harmful, especially for Europe, but also for the U.S. There are a lot of U.S. corporations that fled Russia, and they lost a lot of money. I mean, we're talking about often $100 million or more. And now they're talking about going back in. I mean, there was some sort of, the report said Visa and MasterCard might want to go back into Russia, and other corporations that left. Now, they'll if they go back into Russia now, they'll do okay. They'll make money, but actually they're going to find that it's a completely different environment. They're going to have stiff competition from local competitors, because their absence of the 3 years allowed a lot of Russians to move into the vacuum that they left, and they've done quite well. They'll still be, they'll still have uh, their customers. They'll still do business, but they did make a big mistake by leaving. So yeah. Anyway, I think he understands, and his people understand, that these sanctions actually were not good for the United States. They certainly weren't good for Europe, but sanctions are. It's actually, when let's say you're going after a small country, or a relatively small country like Iran, you can impose sanctions, cause them a great deal of damage. And because they account for a very small percentage of the world's market, or um, it doesn't really affect you. There's not much of a boomerang effect. But Russia is a different case. It's the world's largest commodity supplier. And it is a large market. It's a very significant market. It's the world's fourth largest economy. And so it was just clear that sanctions would have a boomerang effect, and it turned out to have a huge boomerang effect. And in the end, it didn't achieve the damage, but it's a case of shooting yourself in the foot, or as Viktor Orban says, shooting yourself in the lung when he's talking about Europe. Yeah, so yeah, they seem to understand that, and that's a reason to hope. Maybe we really can see some like reduction or elimination of sanctions. The Europeans have stated that even if the U.S. lifts sanctions, they're going to keep them. They just seem to be in a
Right.
suicide pact. It's just crazy.
Can they do that? I mean, will it work if the U.S. is engaging in regular trade? Visa, Mastercard goes back in there. The dollar's allowed, and McDonald's opens back up. And then what is it that EU? It's like just no more Gucci bags. I mean, what
Yeah,
exactly?
right. Yeah, some European companies are still there. They didn't all flee. Um, yeah, well,
I
they
mean, if it
can do
has,
it, but it's just they're just not going to have. Clearly they failed with the U.S. And now if the U.S. actually breaks ranks and begins trading with Russia, then the impact they're trying to punish Russia, but they just punish themselves. I mean, that
exactly.
logic is actually becomes all the more uh, apparent or dominant. Um, so it's ridiculous. These people are idiots, or they're just so um, much under the sway of this ideological vision and this notion of moral purity that they just seem incapable of thinking of practical realities.
Right. This war in Ukraine has exposed so many weaknesses in Western hegemony. I mean, militarily with NATO, we've just seen it. The inability to scale up in munitions production, and just really the ineffectiveness of our weaponry. And then the other thing is also the financial warfare, the economic sanctions that you're talking about, that the freezing of the Russian assets, I think, has been incredibly damaging to the dollar. And we talked about that. Just that could really be one of the death knells for the U.S. If the dollar gets dethroned. And freezing those assets was a huge step in that, because countries like China are looking at that. The U.S. is being very
Right.
antagonistic towards me. And we hold $1 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury. So we got to be careful. We got to
Right.
diversify. We got to build another financial infrastructure to bypass them. But now, do you think that if the sanctions are lifted, in the U.S. lifts its sanctions and Visa, Mastercard go back in, is there, and they, do you think will they unfreeze that $300 billion of Russian assets and give it back to the Russians? And if they make these moves and let the dollar back in with Visa, Mastercard, unfreeze these assets, will that kind of stop that de-dollarization process that we've been seeing ever since the start of this? I mean, it's been going on for a while, but it definitely
Right.
accelerated with these
Well, yeah,
sanction
I'm
packages.
not sure if it's going to stop it. I mean, it's just, but it would slow it at least. Let's put it that way. Um, one thing is just these countries, because they saw it happen. Even if Trump begins to reverse some of it, he's also made threats about using the dollar as a weapon. Let's not forget that, right? And remember his threat, or even his claim to have destroyed BRICS. One of the more outlandish statements he's made. It's, but let's not forget that Trump, though he's not a neocon, he still is interested in throwing America's weight around and wants to remain the top dog. And so people see that and they say, well, okay, maybe they're now regret what they did with Russia, but they may come after me, or and then who knows what's going to happen with the next administration. The fact, that this happened, the unthinkable happened, makes people look at the dollar differently. They can never see it as the same safe, reserve currency that they once saw it as. They can never
So
see
the
it that way
damage
again. The damage is
damage
done.
is irreparable.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay. All right. Just another thing I was thinking is, in terms of repairing relationships between the U.S. and Russia, in a way, Russia and the U.S. now have a common enemy, and that's the deep state, right? I mean, or I should say Trump,
Yeah, right,
Trump
right.
administration and Russia have a common
Right.
enemy, which is the U.S. bureaucratic deep state that has
Yeah.
been, that's being exposed now as funding all these color revolutions and fomenting all this dissent within Russia and Georgia, Moldova. We saw what $22 million spent recently in Moldova for the elections, and
Yeah.
what we're doing in Romania. It's clear, and this is something. And this same deep state apparatus is what attacked Trump as well. So they were both Russia and
A
Trump
common
administration.
enemy,
Right. They're victims of the deep state.
Right.
They've been under attack. So I think they probably, if I'm guessing, the Trump administration probably hates the deep state way more than they hate Russia.
Yeah, I think that's yes, right. It's certainly true of Trump. As I was saying, like Trump takes things very personally, and the establishment, the Democrats in particular, were very, very foolish to go after him the way that they did. With the Russiagate hoax and all the other hoaxes and dirty tricks that they used against him. So when he came back, he just came back, as this roaring bull, this angry monster who's out to destroy him. He just takes it very personally. And one thing he understands is, that Russia was also a victim of this. And I think for that reason, I think he always has friendly feelings towards Russia, but even more so now. It seems, as you say, we have a common enemy, and I think that's important. I mean, I think that probably looms very large in Trump's mind.
Right, and yeah, I know you don't follow people like Joe Rogan, but I do, and Joe Rogan had a guy named Mike Benz on recently. Do you know who that guy is?
No, actually, I don't.
He's been very meticulous about ringing the alarm bells about USAID ever since 2016 and talking about it. So he's been on this for a while.
Right.
And, he was on the podcast and just really laid out just the apparatus and very detailed and having the receipts of like, this is what they do. They've done it in Georgia, and Cuba, Bangladesh, Pakistan, everywhere, how they fund, rap groups and, how all these NGOs. And he talked about the 90% of Ukrainian media being owned by, being funded by USAID. So all this is coming out, and it's going through the largest mouthpiece in the world, which is Joe Rogan, the number one podcast.
Right.
And he was also on Tucker Carlson. So I feel like all the power, all the momentum now, all the guns are being turned on the deep state. It used to be the government administration was just a part of the biggest cog of the deep state. Right. But now that cog's broken off, and they, along with the rest of the world, except the rest of the deep state, which includes apparently the Western Europe, the elites. Yeah. But everybody is aware of it. The whole world is looking at them like, you guys suck. You guys really what you've done. Nobody is happy with it. They're exposed.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm celebrating too early, but I just have this feeling like it's over and we're entering into this new world where we can be friends with Russia, which is a huge step. And I think by being friends with Russia, there's this talk about pivoting to Asia and pivoting to China. Maybe we are, but I just feel like that the dam is broken. And when we start talking to Xi Jinping and having Putin there that we can talk to as well, that we can have an understanding that like, hey, be rational. Do you really think that China or Russia is going to just invade the United States? Like, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. There's no country in the world that is looking at trying to invade America. What are we talking about? Really invading any place, well, I shouldn't say any place. There's always something going on somewhere, but you know what I mean.
Right.
So, I mean, what do you think?
I think it's too early to celebrate. Let me put it differently. I think there's reason to celebrate, what already has happened, because I think these are very notable achievements. Even if the Democrats come roaring back, and they really might. I know that the deep state is taken a blow to the chin and is staggering now, but they're still there, and we got a ways to go. And again, a lot of things could go wrong. I mean, Trump's going and setting off bombs everywhere, and all in all, I think with some notable exceptions, I feel that's good. I mean, again, he's exposing the kind of the ugly underbelly of the deep state, and that's one of his greatest achievements. But the deep state is still there. I mean, he's hurt them by doing that, but they still can come back and get him.
You say that.
Yeah, I know.
How?
Yeah, I don't know. The thing is, they're there. They're powerful. They have their allies in other countries, and these countries don't have a Trump. Don't forget, like, the Russiagate hoax, a lot of it came out of Britain. So there are ways to get back at him. And then I think probably what worries me the most is really the economy, because that's where so many people, that's the basis on which so many people assess a president. And if the economy takes a dive, and it really could, I worry about these tariffs, but even if we set the tariffs aside and maybe they won't do significant damage, I think actually they will. But if they don't, there's still, we still have a very precarious situation. I mean, we'd have this huge, rapidly accumulating debt, and other imbalances in the economy, and the whole thing could come apart during his term, and then he'll get blamed for it, and that just gives power to all those people that hate him, and they can come back and feel like they have a mandate, and who knows. But even, no matter what, I think he's done something. He's wounded them. The beast is wounded, and it's never going to be the same again.
Right. Yeah, I know that there are some, we've talked, when we first started this podcast, we kind of just talked about how the U.S. was just an inevitable decline, and that this collapse was coming no matter what. And do you feel like that's still true, that there's a collapse, or do you feel like because of DOGE that I just never expected that there would be so much movement so effectively from this administration?
Surprise too. But I think actually our initial predictions are still valid. The underlying reality, economic reality, it hasn't changed. Even if DOGE, achieves miraculous successes, it manages to cut government by 10% or something, which would be huge. It's never happened. Government always grows. I'm afraid that in the end, government will still grow. One thing is, like, look, they're not touching the entitlements. We're talking about Social Security and Medicare, which accounts for a huge portion of the budget. It's the majority. And then they're not touching, in fact, talking about increasing the defense budget. And that's huge too. Now they're going after these other things, and they can save some money there. But I think that's actually, in economic terms, their effects may be very, very limited. It's really the political effects, exposing the nefarious doings of these agencies. That's where, they're having real successes. So again, I think the economic crisis, there's nothing that's really changed on that front. It's going to come. And the difference, though, is that we have, again, the deep state has been wounded. The establishment that had this aura of invincibility no longer has it. We have this very rather very unpredictable and flawed, but let's admit, very effective political leader, this man Donald Trump, who is really changing everything. I mean, but in the end, I don't know if he will manage to create, let's say, a real movement. Right now, to a great extent, it's a personality cult. But maybe he will. Maybe just by saying these forbidden things and having, shining the light here and there, he will bring people along. What I hope. Okay, this is like I think maybe the best possible outcome, at least in the short run, is that perhaps J.D. Vance will be the next president. And I think J.D. Vance is somebody who can consolidate the achievements of Donald Trump and maybe, make it into something coherent and long-lasting. And it's not just his personality, right? Because J.D. Vance is that kind of person, I think, who is capable of, maybe building up systems and creating policies that will help to guide us for decades to come. So, that's possible. That right now he is kind of the bull in the china shop. He is the human wrecking ball, and with he is. I think like we said earlier that it's just that he's, I think, better at tearing things down, at least when it comes to the deep state, than to building things up. But there's a next generation coming along who will start to build things up. And
Right.
JD Vance seems like somebody who could do that. Now, well, on the foreign front, there is this potential. Let's really hope it happens. That normal diplomatic relations. Maybe it's too much to think that we could have friendly diplomatic relations, but normal diplomatic relations could be reestablished with Russia, and then we could see an easing or maybe an elimination of the sanctions and increased economic cooperation. That would be a huge achievement if he could do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just you were saying that you don't know if DOGE will be looking at some of these entitlements, but they are looking at Social Security, exposing a lot of fraud, right? Showing that there's 60 million people more than the population of the United States on Social Security. Trump has also talked about having the military budget, the Pentagon and you saw all these defense industries like Lockheed Martin, their stock just plummeted. So
Right.
there is potential.
I think also their stock plummeted because of the possibility of a negotiated settlement for the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah,
that does show you something, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll see. We'll see. I'm still rather. I'm very pleased that again DOGE has exposed these. The reality behind a lot of these agencies. Like I had no idea that USAID was involved in the things that it was. That it was a conduit for funding all these NGOs. Of course, I knew about the NEC and a lot of these other regime change operations. So yeah, that increased my knowledge, and I think a lot of people, even overseas, people that have been victims of USAID, like the Georgian government and other foreign governments, really appreciate the fact that now they can say, hey, we always suspected it, but now the U.S. government itself is admitting it, and it really is going to put their opponents, the people that are attempting to overthrow their governments, are going to put them on the defensive.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, it's an achievement. I have my doubts that there's going to be. I guess because they're up against something so huge. This behemoth just keeps on growing and growing and growing. If DOGE actually succeeds in reducing the federal budget, even if it by 1% rather than having it grow as it always does, I think that would be extraordinary.
Right. Yeah, I can't get enough of DOGE, to be honest. I love just seeing the swamp finally being drained, really gutting so much of this waste and just seeing how corrupt everything was. We always kind of suspected it, and now finally somebody's going through and cleaning it out. But I wonder if there's a risk that you get kind of swept up. You can see that I'm kind of excited, like maybe we're going to be best friends with Russia and everything is going to be great with they're going to fix the U.S. debt problem, clean out the government. But is there a chance that we'll just be throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, that DOGE should we be worried that they're going to cut too much? Or I don't know. I don't know what the government really does for me. We give a lot of money. I mean, there's still potholes in my roads. They don't do a great job. I mean, like, what is it?
Right.
Should we be worried?
I think certain departments, like the Department of Education, really just does not need to exist. It does nothing. And that's what, Ronald Reagan was elected on that platform, but he never did get rid of it. If they could get rid of the Department of Education, I think that would be wonderful for education in the United States. They have a terrible record. They're really, it's a gift to the teachers union is what it is. And that's what you find with a lot of these agencies. So certainly there are agencies that just could go. I have a soft spot for, let's say, the National Park Service and some of the other agencies. And so there is a danger that some damage could be done where real services are being provided. I think, I share a lot of your enthusiasm. But then like I was saying last time, I do make a point of reading what the other side says. I don't, I probably should do even more of that. But they are raising alarm bells about things like, DOGE having access to tax records and so forth. And, maybe there's probably no danger there. But what I have to ask myself is, let's say, if it was a Democratic president and he set it up, and he started looking at tax records, let's be honest, there would be a lot of alarm bells raised or start ringing among the, on the
Republican
red state side of the spectrum. There just would be, let's be honest. And so, they do have some legitimate concerns. And I also mentioned earlier the question of the constitutionality of some of these executive orders. And I think there really is, I'm not an expert or anywhere close to an expert in that kind of thing, but it's, it seems to me that some of these are doubtful or are done on doubtful authority. And of course, a lot of these, moves look good to us. I agree, like exposing USAID was an unalloyed good. But, again, it's like, put yourself in the other side's shoes. Mm-hmm. And yeah, they should admit that, okay, this was disgusting. We shouldn't have done this or whatever. But if you see, like, if again, it was a Democratic leader, let's say it was Gavin Newsom was the president, he just started issuing all these executive orders and going actually after, well, I guess the difference is that there really aren't so many Republican or, conservative leaning institutions. But in some way, like going after the tax records and whatever, and was issuing all kinds of executive orders, undoing things that Trump did, again, on doubtful constitutional grounds, there would be a hue and cry on the conservative side of the spectrum, wouldn't there? Because we just have to admit that. So it is, there are potential dangers. I guess this is, I have read these articles by the Democrats, but as I said earlier, what I notice is complete absence of self-reflection and say, why is Donald Trump doing this? Well, maybe you shouldn't have gone after him the way you did. You used extra constitutional means. Maybe he is to some extent, but you began the process, you initiated it. And we may be, as I said earlier, kind of seeing the unraveling of the old order, that I don't know exactly what lies in the future, but I don't think it's sort of like Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. I don't think we'll ever be able to put the pieces together again.
Right. You're saying the old order is being unraveled, and the question is, what is the new order?
Yeah, that's very unclear. It really is, because the thing is, I can understand a lot of the celebration on the conservative or the MAGA side, but don't forget that. Okay, yeah, Trump won. He won decisively. But it wasn't a complete washout. It wasn't a landslide. And, there's still about half the country, nearly half of the electorate voted for Kamala Harris. And now if he manages, like right now, I think he's doing quite well in the opinion polls. But again, there's always a chance of an economic downturn. And then a lot of his reforms could get, end up in the courts, and I don't know what the other side is doing. It's like you said, there's sort of the deer in the headlights reaction right now, but they're powerful. Even though they've been wounded, let's just not forget they can be creative in the ways that they respond. This term could end up with a very different mood, and we could have a swing back to the other side. And now, that's sort of like we've already taken a step down this road. We departed from much of the Constitution a long time ago, but it seems like there's been a real acceleration. I think we're. What are we going to see? I don't know, but this polarization is intensifying, and it's really tearing at the fabric of our social and political system.
Yeah, we'll see what pops up, but I guess I just feel that the old order was just so bad that I feel like it needs to be torn down. And it is scary that I just feel like surely it won't be worse. It's just the new order, I just hope won't be as nefarious. I mean, all these agencies, if they're exposed and torn down, then at least for the world, it won't be as bad. I feel
Yeah.
like, the newer. I hope so,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, um, it's it is a blow to the rules-based international order. It was. I think actually, of course, what happened in
which
Israel
is code
or
for
in
Western
Palestine.
hegemony, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's right. Yeah, um, yeah, right. We make the rules, we give the orders. Well, that's really what it is. I mean, that's really is not an exaggeration. Um, but yeah, it's this is a real blow to it. It's just like you can't unsee things that you've seen, and just as I think Israel's rampage in Gaza and in southern Lebanon and now in the West Bank, let's not forget what's happening there, uh, was also a huge blow because the U.S. is so tightly, is so tight with Israel, as are some of the Western European or, European powers as well.
Right. Yeah, there just seems to be just a reality check that the Trump administration has, that they understand that things are different. I mean, we saw Pete Hegseth talk about the hard realities and that NATO or that Ukraine will never join NATO,
Yeah.
and that we have to give up territory. We saw Marco Rubio, talk about a multipolar world. Trump straight up said that he thinks that this whole war started because of NATO expansion. So there is this, and I think even more so, what happened is that really prior to the war in Ukraine, I think it was believed probably by all these people, Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, Trump, myself included, I think you, that we were the undisputed military power in the world. But after this conflict over the past 3 years, the result of this war is that Russia has really catapulted itself to the forefront of a military superpower. I feel like people weren't even talking about Russia so much in terms of a great power. It was all about China. China had a massive population, a rapid growing economy, a huge manufacturing base. And people weren't even talking about Russia, which just makes me think as well, just like if China did get involved in some type of military conflict, I think we would see a massive sleeping giant awaken, because that's what Russia was, this sleeping giant. And the world is recognized. And I think Trump, his administration, has recognized this reality that China is this sleeping giant that could even dwarf Russia. And Russia, we woke up that sleeping giant and we were surprised by the strength of it. And not only that, these countries like Russia and China, they have strong leaders, very strong economies, strong diplomacy, and strong societies. Like that you can't, if you're doing a strength comparison between these countries, I don't think the United States is, I think it falls below Russia and China. Would you agree? How would you compare sort of the relative strength? Do you think there's a recognition of that from the Trump administration to some extent? Maybe, we'll still think we're number one, but
Right.
maybe not by much.
Yeah,
And,
I think there has been some recognition. It clearly reflected in the comments. I think very carefully considered comments made by Rubio and also Hegseth. There is a growing acknowledgement of reality. I don't know if they've fully kind of come to fully recognized what's happened, but they seem to be getting there in a way that Tony Blinken and that gang just never showed any signs of awareness or willingness to even consider the possibility. For them, I think, as it was true of the U.S. leadership in general for the longest time, Russia was a has-been. Russia was a gas station masquerading as a country, all that. But now there's still attempts to do that. You'll still hear political leaders in the U.S. talk like that, but the Trump team is starting to talk differently. That's true. And the media, you still see a lot of the denigration of Russia. But there is, I think, just a grudging acknowledgement that maybe we got this wrong. I noticed that, for example, in an article I read or it was a report from the New York Times that I read this morning, there was say a grudging acknowledgement that the Russian economy was actually doing quite well. That's something that they've, after all this talk that it was on the verge of collapse, it was just like it was just going to be okay. They somehow survived because some sort of financial shenanigans or support from China or whatever, but they're going to collapse next month. You hear that month after month after month, but now they're saying actually, okay, let's be honest, that economy looks pretty darn strong. So it's the reality is even seeping down into the New York Times.
Well, that's good. I mean, I'm glad. It's just such a huge step that we have that common sense coming in from this new administration. I just remember seeing Biden, in an interview talking about Russia and then Iran and China. Can the United States afford to fight multiple wars, multiple fronts? He's like, come on, man, we're the United States of America, man. And it's just such a dumb statement, just like you're completely irrational.
Right.
And I feel like we have some sanity here, but
no, it's true. It's true. And that's to be celebrated. We should be thankful for that.
But the sanity, let's hope that more of this, that we continue with this. And I think something that was encouraging that I saw Lavrov was saying that it was a very educational exchange in terms of just sort of like we talked about, the Russia's able to lay out what everything that's happened since the Maidan coup in 2014 and how they tried diplomacy, and they don't want to fight. They want to have good relations. They never avoided talks, and this is just this mess isn't what they wanted. And I think that was I think what Lavrov was saying was educational, means that I think he got through to him.
Yeah, well, that's actually a prediction that I think we made like a couple of months ago. That maybe it's not going to resolve or anything, but it will be educational, because so many American officials seem to believe what they watch on the news and assume that, okay, the Russians must be desperate. And now they're actually talking to the Russians directly, and they're just realizing, no, actually they're very confident. And no, they're not desperate for, any carrot that we offer them. And they're not afraid of any sticks that we might threaten to wield. I think they're probably learning that right now. But it's clear that even they were beginning to recognize that. But this continues let's say the process of education.
Right. But the amazing thing to me is just like, what is Europe doing? That the U.S. is going through this educational process, but European leaders are acting like Joe Biden was. But Joe Biden had the excuse of dementia and being 80 years old.
Right.
Keir Starmer and Macron don't have that excuse.
Right.
So why? Even if the U.S., like we said, the great leader of your Western hegemonic lord is being educated and learning this, you think that just by proxy you would too. You would start to understand and learn, and instead we have these, just hysteria coming out of Europe. Keir Starmer talking about sending troops, and Macron seems to. Where's that coming from? Why this reaction from Europe?
Yeah, well, it just, again, if Biden had been, or Kamala Harris had been reelected, we would see the same thing still coming out of the U.S. So these are administrations that were fully on board and are deeply invested in let's say the old narrative, which I think at the center of that narrative is a notion of Western supremacy. Not only is it, let's say, military supremacy and economic supremacy, but maybe most importantly, it's moral supremacy. This is something that they believe in very strongly. They think they're blinded by their own halos. And because they assume that they're this shining bright light, that anybody opposes them is a demon. This is, it's clear from the language they use that this is their thinking. And those administrations that are still in power in Europe, again, they're still there and they're still committed to the vision. And I don't think they're capable of giving up the vision. So they just need to be thrown out of office. I think that's the only thing. And there's a real chance because, already, even before Trump began his term, we saw there was a definite movement towards these populist um, parties in Europe. They clearly were, rising in power and threatening the establishment there. But it seems to me that like what's happening in the U.S. now can only give impetus to that movement, and it's through them. There's a chance that we could see a real revolution in Europe. Now, again, it's just like the fight isn't over. I know, it's very thrilling what we see, but this is like the first round in a 15-round fight, and um, that establishment, yeah, though it's wounded, though it's isolated, still the establishment, and they can fight back like they've shown they have. They got all kinds of dirty tricks, and they just may become. I think I said in one episode earlier, it's just that they will become, as Vance was pointing out, increasingly authoritarian. That may be. See, that's the flip side of their obsession with moral purity. They can't let the devil take power, so therefore, they have to do everything, and they are morally justified in doing anything to keep the devil out of power. So we'll have an interesting fight on our hands there in Europe, and a fight that in some way reflects what might happen here in the U.S. too.
Mm. Well, what moves is Europe currently making with regard to the Ukraine-Russia
Yeah,
conflict? I mean,
well,
what are they?
Macron called together an emergency meeting after the Munich Security Conference, and he invited most European countries to it. He definitely left out like Hungary and Slovakia, but oddly, he also left out Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, and one other country that slips my mind at the moment. And they were saying, "Look, why did you leave us out?" And the second time he extended an invitation to because he's calling a second emergency meeting, but he again did not invite Slovenia. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on in Slovenia. Slovenia is not Slovakia. They're supposed to be on board with these things. Um, but the meeting is an attempt to, I think, really to circle the wagons, to unify Europe, to make it clear that they're staying the course in their support for the Ukraine, the Kiev regime. And they're also meant to discuss the possibility of a European army. Now, I think all of these things are, this is going to fail. It's absurd. It's again, they're echoing or maybe responding to the call of Zelensky. In his speech at the Munich Security Conference, he went on and on about how Europe must unify. Europe, should create its own army, and that's what they seem to be making some attempt, but they haven't gotten anywhere. I think after the first meeting, there wasn't even a statement. There was no agreement, and I doubt that there'll be any substantial achievement in the second meeting. Yeah, so their initial reaction is just I seems to me very just emotional and not thought out. They're not looking at the realities like, Hegg says they're the hard realities on the ground that you look at. Look, with the United States, who is by far the most powerful part of NATO, you were not able to hold the Russians back. The Russians have been advancing. Recently they've been advancing, of course, steadily for the last, almost year, well, about year in particular. Avdiivka fell in February of last year. There was a slowdown in January because there was an unusually warm month, and so you had a return of what they call the Rasputitsa, which is the mud season. It's a season of bad roads, and it just makes advances like anywhere off of a paved road very, very difficult. But that's changed, and the ground is hardening as they're getting a normal winter now in February. So in recent, like last week, we've seen some very notable advances. Well, in any case, they never slowed down. They slowed down for a while, but they never stopped advancing. And this was with, everything that NATO could provide, NATO, including the U.S. If the U.S. pulls out and it just becomes a matter of Europe, what are you thinking? If you couldn't do it without the U.S., how are you going to do it on your own? Let's just be honest.
So you think that they're not going to send troops. It's all talk.
No,
Do you think that's
I
it?
think
It's
so.
just
Yeah,
all
they
bluster.
really aren't. Because
There's nothing they can do, right? There's nothing.
no, like it's interesting. Like the only country that maybe could have sent troops that were really capable of doing something was Poland, and they've said they're not going to do it. There was even recently one of the Baltic states said, "Oh no, we can't do that. We will support the cause in other ways, but we can't do that." So you just have France and the UK. But as we've pointed out, though they have on paper they have some kind of army, not very impressive. I think 60,000, theoretically combat capable troops in the UK, and maybe double that in France. They don't have enough munitions to fight more than a week or two. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So they can't. So what are they talking about? I mean, the Russians know they don't have any cards to play, but they live in this fantasy world. Again, they can't really abandon the idea of being part of this, being in the garden, and as Joseph Borrell said, and being just superior to the rest of the world, able to, mete out punishments and rewards as they see fit. They're still living in the unipolar moment, but that is coming let's be honest, is crashing down around them. It's not just the advance of the Russians, but the great hegemon, the United States appears to be abandoning the cause. But instead of waking up, they're just retreating more deeply into their fantasy.
I mean, they got to feel kind of stupid, right? I mean, Keir Starmer and Macron.
I don't think so. I think Macron thinks he's a genius. Now, Macron's a clever guy, but I think he's so vain that sometimes when you're really, really vain, you can't see reality because you just kind of imagine that that everybody adores you, everything you do. And the truth is, he's very, very unpopular within France. I don't think he's going to remain in office much longer. And Keir Starmer, I think, is just plain stupid. I'll be honest.
Really?
I think he really, yeah.
It's amazing. There's something fundamentally wrong with the Western political systems. If, for example, in the United States, the top person that DNC can come up with is Kamala Harris. You can't even do an interview unscripted. They can't even, like, how does that happen? And then you got Keir Starmer that doesn't seem to even know what is the state of his country. That they're just so out of touch with reality. It's just, there's something wrong with our systems, right?
Yeah,
why are they still wrong?
Yeah, well, I think it's the system might not be so much the problem, or there's certainly aspects of the system that are, but it's maybe not so much the system as the people. I remember somebody telling me, a philosophy student many years ago, decades ago, actually, that it's like there's no system you can devise that can't be undone by the demons. His meaning was that in the end, everything does depend on reliable, honest, hardworking people, competent people. And and so you can devise the most, perfect system in the world, but if it's staffed with incompetence or with scheming, devious careerists and so forth, it'll come undone. And I think the problem is it's really just the quality of the people that rise to the top in our systems now. I mean, we don't have any statesmen. We don't. They're all non-entities, and what we have. It's just.
Does that mean we have to gut the system if it's completely infected with?
Yeah, or there just has to be or at least, I'm sure that there's changes that need to be made to the system. Yeah, but but I think more than anything, you just need a whole new, a changeover in personnel. I mean, you just can't. I think the people that are in charge now, both the elected representatives and the people that head these bureaucracies and probably staff most of the bureaucracies, they need to go and they need to be replaced. So you need a true revolution, and in Europe, and we're seeing what may possibly be the beginning of a revolution in the United States. Europe needs the same. Now, again, there's some reason to be hopeful. It's just. What's happening in the U.S. The U.S. policies have a huge impact on Europe. Now, Trump in his first term, you're right, he was greeted with horror when he first took office back in 2017. But um, he was tamed, and then Biden took office, and I think there was a collective sigh of relief among the leadership of the European leadership. And they thought, well, that was just that aberration. It'll never happen again. But now Trump's come back, and he's really serious this time. And so I think things have really changed. That's why we're having emergency meetings. They realize, oh, this is serious. And I don't think they've really even begun to come to grips with it. It's just they're in a state of shock and hysteria right now, and they're not thinking clearly, at some point. But just the fact of this, like I said, that just has to give ammunition. In the past, it was just like the populist parties really weren't helped much by Trump in the first term, again, because he really didn't do anything, and then he was gone. But now, it's just like, hey, the hegemon has left us, and he's actually supporting the populists. And I would be very surprised if that doesn't have an effect, an electoral effect. That doesn't give a big boost to those populist parties in Europe.
Right. When you say that there needs to be a revolution and that we might be seeing a revolution here in the United States, what do you mean by revolution? Because it conjures up images of an armed uprising in my mind.
Yeah.
So what are you talking about?
Yeah. I guess it's a revolution within government, but it's not a true revolution, right? A revolution should come from the grassroots up. But I think you can make an argument that in Europe, you have these parties that really do have coherent policies, have been very critical of the establishment and its core policies for a long time, and they do have grassroots support, and they're building up. If they do win, and then they really carry out these changes, you could, if they do just restaff these bureaucracies, which I think is that they would have to do, if they can carry that out, it would be. I think it's. I suppose if you're going to be technical about it, it's not exactly a revolution because they're working within the system. Right. But they could really remake the system. There's a potential for that. Maybe the system's beyond salvation, and we might have to have a real revolution, which is always a messy affair and often doesn't produce the desired results. And in the U.S., I guess I'm using the term very loosely. But I guess what I just want to emphasize is not what we're seeing now is not the typical Democrat, Republican alteration that I've seen all my life. There's a new a Republican comes into office or a Democrat comes into office, and you're told, the other side always described him as a monster. Of course, the rhetoric has become much more heated over the last decade or so. But it was supposed to be a real sharp difference. And then whoever came into power ended up doing pretty much like what was always done. That's what I've seen. Now, this is really the first time in my memory that I've seen in my, my lifetime, or at least since I've been aware of what's politics. And it goes back to when I was 12 years old, where I've seen this, where there seems to be a fundamental, reassessment and redirection, old policies that were supposed to be core policies are being trashed. If you remember, I think it was during the impeachment proceedings against Trump, the first impeachment attempt. It was, I think it was Vindman. It was a Ukrainian American. He testified and he was saying well, Donald Trump was trying to go against our policy. So that is right there is a revelation of what we call the deep state. We could also just call it the blob or the entrenched bureaucracy. There's a notion that, hey, this is what we do, in the State Department, and what does the president think that he could come in and muck around here? This is, and it's clear if you just look back over the decades, that's how it's been, and presidents have generally just accepted it. And this is the first time where they're going in, and I think they're just in a state of shock. So that's perhaps it's not quite revolutionary, but it's just it goes far beyond anything that I've seen before. Again, it may fall apart, but like we said many times, they've already done something that was never done before, and I think they've just, they uh, the effects of this are going to be long lasting.
Okay. Exciting times. We're in
Yeah.
uncharted waters. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's end it there, Dad. I think
Okay.
it's a good. All right. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.